Welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Adventist mission to the world.
To find out more about the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org.
We are so glad that you have joined us. I am Sam Neves.
And I'm David Trim. And you know, Sam, this is the 48th episode of Mission 150.
Wow.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that many, does it?
Right.
But we've been doing it a while now. And the week that this podcast will be released is the actual 150th episode of the departure of John N. Andrews and his children Charles and Mary. Yes, 150 years ago this week, they sailed from New York, headed for England, en route to Switzerland to serve as the Seventh-day Adventist Church's first missionaries.
Exciting.
If our listeners and viewers want to know more about the Andrews family and the circumstances of their departure, go back and listen to episodes 5 and 6 when we were joined by Andrews' biographer, Gilbert Valentine. Today, Sam, in honor of the boldness shown 150 years ago, we are going to look at another moment of great boldness in Adventist mission history.
And when was that?
During the Second World War, indeed remarkably at the height of the conflict. Now, the World War inevitably had a very negative impact on the missionary on the missionary enterprise, I should say. Some missionaries were brought home. Other mission fields couldn't communicate with their parent organization and receive directions. They couldn't communicate with the World Church, or it took them months to do so. And after Italy joined the war and the Germans began their submarine campaign, it was no longer safe to send messages through the Mediterranean. So any messages from India or from the Middle East had to go all the way around Africa and then up to America. So the war, naturally enough, had a very major and negative impact. The interesting thing is, as soon as the war was over, indeed even before the war was over, there was an increase in the number of missionary appointees sent out, and indeed after World War II it became a huge increase. Why was that? It was thanks in large part to the men who served from 1936 to 1950 as General Conference President and Secretary, respectively, J. Lamar McElhaney as President and Ernest D. Dick as the Secretary.
Okay, so the war started in the late 30s, 39 was the
Yep.
official beginning of the war as Hitler invaded Poland and et cetera.
Yes.
But America did not join it for 2-3 years.
America didn't join until December of 1941.
But a lot of the work in Africa that we talked about before and the Middle East, what we refer to as North Africa, Middle East, and so on, was still coordinated by different European parts of the church, correct?
That's right.
So what impact did that have? Was that the first part to be impacted, or do we know?
No, that's right. Those are the first parts to be impacted. Firstly, wherever there were any German missionaries, and there were some in the Middle East, for example, they were interned by the British. So they were put into prison camps, not prisoner of war camps because they weren't soldiers, but they were interned and put into prison camps where they remained for the duration of the war. Secondly, you have some missionaries who say, oh, in these circumstances, we want to go home. And there are other places where fighting soon starts. So, for example, in the Middle East, the General Conference was very keen to withdraw missionaries, though in the end they didn't withdraw that many because there wasn't necessarily a safe route for them to be evacuated.
So it was bad there, but it was worse trying to get back home.
Yes, potentially. Especially, say, for Scandinavian missionaries.
Right, that would have to cross the entire battle zones or face the submarines or
Exactly. So it's Africa and the Middle East that get the first impact. Actually, for that first 18 months, until Japan entered the war in December of 1941, you could get mail delivered from India to America across the Pacific Ocean. That still takes a long time because it's such a vast
But it was
stretch
safer.
of-
Once Japan entered the war, no longer safe.
It was no longer possible at all. So at that point, everything from India has to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and up to the United States. And also you couldn't just send things on a ship the way you used to because ships would wait until they could sail in convoys to protect themselves from German submarines. So,
Okay.
so the whole thing was greatly delayed. And yet, at the spring meeting of 1942, Sam, church leaders took a series of bold decisions. And that's notable because the spring of 1942 was perhaps the worst period of the war for the Allies. Now, why does that matter? In theory, of course, the church didn't take sides, but Seventh-day Adventists generally wanted the Allies to win. Partly because of the church's membership, 40% was still in North America, but partly because the Nazis and the Japanese were so anti-Christian, and were engaging in activities that the full dimensions of the Holocaust, the Shoah, weren't known until after the war. But enough was already known to make it clear, this is not like the First World War, a clash of empires and nation states. There is real good and evil going on here.
And they had that notion. Did they publish things that encouraged one way or another? How did the church act in the middle of a world war?
That's a good question. I haven't researched that myself in detail, so I would not like to venture a guess. I mean, one of the things that the church does in particular is it has prophecy seminars and evangelistic campaigns in which it says, the advertising says things like, Hitler will not win. How do we know? Because
Daniel 2, the statue and the fingers.
Exactly,
the feet.
exactly. We know how it's going to turn out, and of course this is a great time to be sharing those prophetic truths, and there's a big market for it, and accessions in the church actually go up. And also from that sense, as the famous saying has it, there's no atheists in foxholes. During war, people want divine protection, they want reassurance.
We are seeing this in Ukraine too, as the church boldly proclaims, and accessions have increased.
Yes.
During this current war there.
That's right, that's right. So
Okay.
the church...
So it's spring meetings.
Yeah, but
the Allies
I
are...
was just going to say, the church doesn't overtly push the Allied cause, but if you read the church papers of the times, the Review and the various division papers that are out, you can see that they want the Allies to win.
Okay.
So from the Adventist perspective, the Allies are the side you want to win the war, and yet in the spring of 1942, it's by no means clear that the Allies are going to win the war. We know, of course, but in the spring of 1942, things are going pretty badly. The Japanese had entered the war in December of 1941 and had pretty quickly rolled through the whole of Southeast Asia and up to the border with India. They'd conquered the Philippines, the American colony of the Philippines, the big Dutch colony of what is today Indonesia, the British colonies. The Germans, meanwhile, are doing very well on the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union. They're advancing at a rapid rate of knots. This is not a good time for the Allies. And so you could understand it if church leaders at this point said, we've got to be very cautious.
Let's take a step back.
Right.
But they don't do that.
But they don't do that. And also there's the financial implication. Now, of course, again, 40% of the church's membership is in North America. But there's a significant membership in Germany. You can't get any tithes and offerings from them. It's now very difficult to get tithes and offerings transmitted from South Africa or Australia. So church income has had an impact as well. So this would be the good time to say, let's be cautious. Let's pull our, let's, like the snail, let's retreat into our shell. They don't do that. Why not? Because those leaders, I think, have the vision. Ernest D. Dick, the GC secretary, particularly pushes things forward, but of course, as we know how the church operates, a major initiative could never have succeeded if it hadn't had the strong support of the president, McElhaney. Both men realized, I think, an important point. There's been contraction in the missionary effort, and things have slowed down. But at some point, the war is going to end. And if the church isn't ready when the war ends, then that means the period of contraction and difficulties is going to extend until the church can get itself prepared. So the thing to do is to start preparing while the war is still going on.
Wow.
So that you can hit the ground running
When it's finished.
As soon as the war is finished.
That takes a lot of vision and courage.
Absolutely so, 100%. And actually, June of 1942 is probably the absolute nadir of the Allies' fortunes in the war, and that's about the time that they're beginning to implement the Spring Meeting Initiative. So, where do these men get this courage from? I think it comes from the Holy Spirit, and from, they have vision themselves. But the willingness to do this really is extraordinary. For us looking back, it's easy to say, well, we know how the war's going to end, so of course you get prepared. But no, that's not the situation. It really looks in the spring and early summer of 1942 like the Allies could lose this. In fact, it looks more likely that the Allies will lose than that they will win. Mm-hmm. And yet here is the church saying, no, we're going to be ready as soon as the war is over. This is how one of the GC associate secretaries described the initiative soon after it was voted in a letter to a former missionary. He said, at the spring meeting of the General Conference Committee, earnest consideration was given to the necessity of having missionary families under appointment and securing such preparation as is available here in the homeland for work when this present conflict ceases, or when the Lord otherwise indicates that the way is open for missionaries to be sent forward once more. The General Conference has decided that 10 families should be immediately placed under appointment and definitely earmarked for work in the Muslim lands in the Near East, with the understanding that arrangements would be made for these missionary appointees to study the language of the field and other subjects here in this country in preparation for the time when they can go forward to these mission fields. It is understood that it may be a year or two or possibly longer before the Lord opens the way to these fields once more.
Wow.
So let's just decode the language. Missionaries placed immediately under appointment means they are actually now missionaries.
They're called, they are learning the language, they are going to go.
They're being paid.
They're being paid, absolutely.
So this is their job.
Yes.
Their job is to train and be ready for as soon as the Lord opens the way. So you're taking people who otherwise might be doing evangelistic or pastoral labor, and you're paying them to wait.
To prepare to go. Now, the church is already quite sophisticated in the way they understand mission by this point, because they've been doing this for a while. And they know that once you arrive in this place, the first couple of years is just adapting and learning. So it seems to me that they are really trying to speed up that process by saying, hey, you can't adapt completely, but start learning the language, start immersing yourself in that culture as much as possible, even while you're here, so that it will speed up when you get there and we don't waste the time.
Yes.
There seems to be an urgency here, David, that we see in these leaders for fulfilling this mission.
That's it exactly, sir. And yes, one of the things that normally happens when missionaries go to the mission field is that they spend a few months learning the language and learning the culture too. So that, the first 6 months easily you're not actually spending in missionary work. So they're saying, okay, we can't help with the cultural adaptation, or not entirely, but what we can ensure is that they already know the language and that they understand something about the circumstances. You note that wording, the missionary appointees to study the language of the field and other subjects. Mm-hmm. So you're going to teach them about the culture they're going to go to. Of course, nothing can replace actually being exposed to that culture, but at least you're going to learn some things about it, and you're going to shorten the process of adaptation once you're actually in the field.
Yeah. So they voted. How long does it take for them to start calling these families?
So they voted at spring meeting, and by the summer they're starting to identify the 10 missionary families and bring them to Washington, D.C. so that they can study at the recently established Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. Today that's at Andrews University in Michigan, but back then the seminary was actually next door to the General Conference headquarters in Washington.
I did not know that.
Yeah, yeah. So they take these 10, and note too the language, the families. So there's a recognition here that it's not just the man that you call.
That's right, it's the family that is called.
It's the family that is called.
Interesting.
And the training that they're going to do is not just for the men. The wives do it as well.
Beautiful.
Because they need to speak the language, they need to understand their culture they're going into. So we don't think there's anything for the children, whereas today, as we know from interviewing people from the Institute of World Missions, they do have special programs for the children, so they're not quite that.
They're not there yet.
They're not there yet.
But they're on their way.
But they're training the man and the wife as well. So when things are at their worst in the war, here are these new missionary families arriving at Washington, D.C. And so this is an immense gesture of faith to say, soon, whether it's 1 or 2 years or maybe longer, but the Lord is going to open the way again and we are going to be ready. Now, it took a little while to get people in place at the seminary to do the training, because remember, they're training 10 families initially for Muslim areas. And there's a significance to that I'll come back to, Sam, later. But some of the first missionary families to arrive were initially sent to the Kennedy School of Missions, which actually advertised itself as an interdenominational religious university. So that's a big thing for Adventists, especially in this period, to send students to a non-Adventist institution. But the Kennedy School of Missions was known for its expertise in Islam. So they initially send some to the Kennedy School of Missions, and this, I think, the willingness to send Adventists to a non-Adventist institution speaks volumes about how determined church leaders were to make a major impact on Muslim lands just as soon as there was an opportunity.
It also shows that there is, again, a more distinct sophistication in their thinking. Because if you've worked as a missionary before in a land that isn't Christian, there is an immediate connection with other Christian families from other denominations. We don't see it in Christian nations, but I remember visiting Albania when I was a teenager, spent 3 months there with the missionary family that was there. There was tremendous connection with the other, I think it was a Baptist ministry family, missionary family that was there, and other Christian churches, because they had just come out of communism, and there was this hunger for spirituality.
Yes.
But there was a great connection between the Adventists and the other Christians that were there. And in specializing to Muslim nations and Muslim people, the leaders obviously recognized that that there was something that they were offering that was of value to our own missionaries.
Yep.
And to this day, we still read books that are non-Adventist about mission, and we still engage with best practices and what have you, because the mission is more important than our separation.
That's right. And I mean, exactly as you say, Sam, for missionaries, they feel a closeness to other Christians that they don't feel in the homelands, where other Christians are, in some people's view at least, almost our enemies. There's certainly, that's putting it harshly, but for some Adventists that's so, and for most they're not enemies, but they're
there's us and there's them.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas I know from my parents talking about their missionary experience in India, that they felt a closeness to other Christians because you have more in common with them than you do with Hindus or Muslims and so forth. And if you read missionary memoirs of this period, they talk about associating with other Christian missionaries and doing so in a very happy way. So this shows the sophistication of their thought that says, all right, we may see ourselves in, as you put it, in an us and them situation in the homeland, but we recognize these people have expertise
that we need.
They've done missionary work. They've developed expertise at a theoretical level through missiology, which we don't necessarily have, so we're going to take advantage of that.
Yeah, good.
Now, but the other thing church leaders did was to bring in to the seminary to teach there a person who we have looked at in 2 previous episodes, George D. Keogh, the pioneer missionary to the Middle East.
So Keogh came here.
Huh. Of course, he was a mission contextualizer par excellence.
Yes.
So
those were my favorite episodes, by the way.
I think they're my favorite episodes as well, to be honest. We've covered a lot of really interesting and moving subjects, but I think those were, I agree with you, I think those are our best episodes. So George and his wife Marianne were in Palestine. They were in Jerusalem as head of the of the Arabic Union Mission, it was then called. He was president of the Arabic Union Mission. But so they had to call him, and that took a little while before war circumstances made it safe for them to travel. But in 1942, they left Jerusalem and started the journey to America. So they were brought to Washington from the Arabic Union Mission to head a program both teaching Arabic language but also teaching the culture and about Islam. And they taught that at the seminary. Keogh was aided by a second faculty member who was an Iraqi Adventist who had come to the United States, a man called Khalil Ibrahim, who had adopted the American name Carl Bremson. He'd emigrated to the States. So this is a considerable commitment by the church as well. First, you're paying 10 missionary couples and taking care of their families, and now you've added 2 staff members to the seminary, which at this stage was quite a small operation. You've added 2 staff members specifically for this program.
There was another sacrifice here. Here you have people that are practicing what they do over there, and there is always the temptation to leave them there. Look, they're doing a good job,
right.
Leave them there. There is a sacrifice in slowing down the work by removing them from there so that immediately you are less, you have less capacity, but medium to long term, they are training 10 families. They are training a whole new generation that will be able to do what they do. Yes. And from Keogh's perspective, he's the guy that decides, I'm not going to stay in the mission compound. I'm going to go to meet people where they are in the rural areas. I want to immerse myself in this culture. So he lives throughout his ministry, and now he has an opportunity to mentor others, yep. Which is usually the cycle of ministry. You experience it, God works within you in the first few years, then God works through you, and now God brings you to train others who are going to continue the work that you do. So we see all of this in this arc. Beautiful.
Yeah. So their job is to train missionaries to the Middle East theologically and culturally as well as practically. And not just the men, again, the women, the wives also took the course that Keogh and Bremson taught. And we know this because we have a photograph of the graduating class of the first 20 to finish the program. And on the video version, we will share a photograph of that first class of 20 to finish this program, who graduated in February 1944. And we have Keogh's, in the archives, we have Keogh's notes for his lectures. And so we know he wasn't just teaching Arabic. He was teaching Arabic, and in fact, his title, I think, is Professor of Arabic. But that sounds like he's just a language teacher, and actually he's doing more. He's teaching them about Islam. He's teaching them about the subtleties of what different Muslims believe. He's teaching them about the culture. So they are giving them a springboard to mission preparedness, exactly as you discussed, so that they don't have to spend time once they get into the field. They've had a shortcut in the process.
They're standing on the shoulders of a giant.
Yeah, yeah. And February 1944, the General Conference promptly started a new class through the program. Meanwhile, the war situation had improved. The Allies were on top. There was no longer fighting in the Middle East or North Africa. And so the first 4 graduates of the program actually sailed to Egypt in April 1944.
Even before the war is over.
Even before the war is over. They were Neil and Eleanor Wilson and Gordon and Evelyn Zitkowski. And 35 years later, Neil C. Wilson became the General Conference.
That's Neil Wilson.
Yeah. Neil C. Wilson, who in 1979 became the General Conference president.
Wow.
And of course is the father of the current president, Elder Ted Wilson. But Neil Wilson's missionary service, he'd actually grown up in India where his parents were missionaries, but his own missionary service started in Egypt in 1944.
So he was one of those 10 families set aside.
Exactly.
He studied it under Keogh and others.
And in the photograph you can see him and his wife standing at the back immediately behind Keogh.
And that's why Ted Wilson, the current president, talks about Egypt as part of his formation. Was he...
He was born there.
Beautiful.
He was born in the Middle East. So Within a year of the end of the war, considerable numbers of new missionaries began arriving in the Middle East. The other priority of church leaders was China. And there was an extraordinary resurgence in missionary numbers surprisingly soon after the end of the war. Now, of course, we've talked about this before, how many missionaries had already been evacuated from China in 1941 because people could see that the war was coming. And the United States encouraged Americans to leave. Mm-hmm. Sadly, what had happened, and we touched on this in a previous episode, quite a number of those evacuated from China were sent to the Philippines, which was thought to be safe, where they get swept up by the Japanese and they're imprisoned in horrible, really appalling conditions for the rest of the war. There are missionaries who remain in China, and we've talked about this. Appel is who we talked about is one of them. And there are others as well who we've talked about in previous episodes. Those missionaries are basically trapped there until the war is over. Mm-hmm. In 1945 and 1946, when Asia was still in chaos and transportation was extremely difficult and much of the seagoing capacity was devoted to bringing home American servicemen, but in 1945 and 46, despite the chaos of the Asia-Pacific region, missionaries who had stayed on through the war were taken home on well-deserved furloughs because they'd gone through a pretty rough time. And of course, you've got the missionaries who had been imprisoned, who have been freed, liberated by the American army. They get brought home too to rest and recuperate. And in many cases, that takes them a couple of years to get fully recovered.
And furlough normally meant every 7 years of service, they would spend 6 months at home before going back, if they would go back, right? But now, because of the war, to some of them, it takes longer than 6 months to recover, understandably.
Yeah, and for some of them, it's been longer than 6 or 7 years before they're sent home. Even in 1946, though, new missionaries are sailing for China. In 1946, they're returning the missionaries who'd been on furlough,
but they're
sending new missionaries as well. So they're very quick to do it. By the end of 1946, there were 93 missionaries working in the China division, including 41 ordained ministers. By the end of 1947, the total number had increased to almost 130, had increased to almost 50%. There were 135 missionaries, of which 55 were ordained ministers.
Wow.
And 1948 saw another increase to 158 foreign missionaries. So they ratchet up the commitment to China very quickly and match what it was before the war within just a couple of years. It's an extraordinary pace of resurgence. The sad thing is, the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War meant these numbers then collapsed in 1949 and 1950.
Communism has a way of destroying the possibility for missionaries.
It absolutely did. And so all the missionaries, including the ones who've only almost just arrived, only been there a couple of years, have to be pulled out. But nevertheless, the pace of growth, the speed with which missionary commitment was ratcheted up, these are both extraordinary. And again, Dick and McElhaney are the secretary and president who are responsible. So here's the thing, Sam. What's striking to me is that the World Church's top priorities after the destruction of World War II, priorities that were set during the war so that the church could and did seize the missional initiative as soon as the war ended, the priorities were the heartland of two of the world's great faiths, Islam and Confucianism.
That is very interesting.
These are the world religions, as we would call them today. Mm-hmm. Dick and McElhaney, in other words, saw the goal of Adventist mission and the GC's role in it in the same way as had visionary former presidents Arthur Daniels and William Spicer. We talked about this. They saw the role of the GC as to reach non-Christian people with the gospel. And this is exactly what McElhaney and Dick are trying to do in the depths of World War II and immediately afterwards. Let's reach people who've never heard of Jesus. So we'll send missionaries to the Middle East and we'll send them to China.
So the theme is the role of the General Conference is to send people to parts of the world church that are not strong enough to take care of themselves,
Yes.
which is the same principle that you see in a local conference. So let's say a conference has 100 cities within its territory. 80 of those cities or towns have Adventist churches in them. Whose responsibility is it to look to the 20 cities that don't have any representation
Right.
and to reach them? It's the local conference. They are responsible for that. They should put plans in place. They should use the tithe and offerings that they receive to make provision for planting churches in those 20 cities. And then you go to a union level. If at a union level, let's say the country we're talking about is divided in states, and there is strong presence in 5 of the 6 states that union covers, it is the responsibility of the union to bring together resources to help encourage this other state to grow.
Right.
And if you keep going like this, that you end up with the General Conference and its 13 divisions, they're all part of the General Conference, wanting to focus on areas that don't have a strong Adventist presence. The temptation, however, is to think in such a localized way that the strong become stronger.
Yes, exactly.
And the weak become weaker,
Yeah.
which is not good. So it is absolutely appropriate, even today, for the General Conference to think through and put plans and call for resources so that we can reach those regions that have not yet have the strength to continue the work themselves.
Right. And if the General Conference does it, it's not going to happen.
If the General Conference does not do it, it won't happen. Is that what you mean?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I mean. And actually, this has been our custom, our practice since the very beginning. Back in 1863, when the church gets founded, they take resources from the conferences, the states where the church is strong, and they put them into parts of the United States where it's weak. So the first missionary they send is John N. Loughborough, who actually gets sent to New England, and they call him a missionary. He goes from Michigan to New England.
Which isn't very far.
Which isn't very far, but the point is, this is a mission field because the church is weak. So the church is paying somebody who the New England Conference couldn't have paid for by itself to go to New England and labor there, and they call that missionary labor. Eventually, of course, as we've discussed, the term missionary comes to mean a foreign missionary. Mm-hmm. But so as early as 1863-64, the church is saying, right, we will, from the General Conference, take resources to send somebody to work in an area where the church is weak, to build it up. And that's exactly what they do when they send to Switzerland.
Yes. Another lesson that I see from the Second World War episode that we just did is that they couldn't go to certain places because of the war. But they were bold enough to prepare families to go when those places would open up.
Yeah.
1 year, 2 years, or however long it takes, the language that we read said. There are places in the world today, David, that it's illegal to bring a Bible to.
Yes.
Those are closed places. There are places that are in conflict. There are all sorts of places that are seemingly impossible for us to reach. Do we have the same boldness to prepare missionaries to go there in a way that when it opens, because we are promised that this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to every human being alive. Those places will open at some point.
Yes.
When they do, are we ready?
I think we are. We could always be bolder, but this is part of the point of what's called mission refocus, which the church has put a great deal of emphasis on since the annual council of 2022. And the refocus part is to say, let's focus on those parts of the world where the church is weak. Because just through the mission drift that inevitably happens, we have lost sight a little bit of this practice that we had had. I said it's been a historic practice, but we had lost sight of it a little bit. And so the emphasis is also to say, not just let the General Conference do the work, but let every territory adopt missionaries, even ones that receive missionaries themselves. So, for example, the Middle East and North Africa Union, which is attached directly to the General Conference and is a vast mission field, is nevertheless sending missionaries themselves. Because if you have the spirit of mission, then it will help you in your own work. So the GC, the world, and not just the GC, the world church is putting resources into mission now in a way that it hadn't perhaps quite so much for a number of years. And having visited parts of the world, and I'm going to be deliberately vague in order not to imperil church members in the countries I'm talking about. Having been to certain parts of the world, we know that the church, in areas where the church in theory has no members, actually we do, because the church is operating cautiously and under circumstances of great difficulty. So it has to operate cautiously, but the church is operating. And I'm thinking of one particular country in the Middle East. There is a missionary assigned to it. He doesn't live there because he can't live there, but he lives in the country immediately to the west of it, which has a freer system of government and where he can operate, and he brings in people from that country into where he's living to work with them and to baptize them. And then they go back and work as witnesses themselves. So the church is showing boldness. Could we show more? Yes, the answer is always. We can always do more, and we always should be seeking and striving to do more. And I would say particularly in North America, where the church is so rich and blessed with material prosperity.
And also human resources.
And indeed, with human resources, the church in America could be doing more to adopt mission fields, not just waiting for the General Conference to send missionaries, but putting its own resources in, as the rest of the world is now doing. So more could be done, but actually the church is showing considerable boldness.
I can see that.
And flexibility to work beyond its normal operating procedures,
Right.
to work in different ways in order that the message be spread.
When Mission Refocus was introduced, there were quite a few fields that were skeptical.
Yeah.
Like, it's so hard here. Why would I why would I sponsor missionaries to go elsewhere? My resources are for my own territory.
Yeah.
But over the last couple of years, I have seen tremendous impact of this different kind of thinking. And I hope that it really takes on the majority, if not all of our fields, to have that courage to do it.
Yeah.
David, thank you for these insights. This was a very eye-opening episode. I had never thought of the church mission during the war, and now it's clearer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us again on Mission 150, which tells the story of the 150 years of Adventist mission to the world.
Please keep watching on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel or on Adventist Review TV, or keep listening on your favorite podcast platform.
To know more about the Adventist mission work today, go to adventistmission.org.
And for opportunities for service today, go to vividfaith.com.
Join us each episode to learn, to be challenged, and to be inspired to become part of the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.